She conquered the Sultan's heart with a smile, and ended her life surrounded by whispers, rot, and divine judgment. She was once Alexandra Lisowska, a Ruthenian slave girl sold into the heart of empire. But in the golden harem of Suleiman the Magnificent, she became Hurrem Sultan, mother of princes and mistress of power. Her enemies died by strangulation, her rivals vanished in silence. But in her final years, something began to rot inside her, not only in the body, but in the soul. Her end was not a swift downfall, but a slow unraveling, eaten from within, feared by all, loved by none. She was not born Hurrem Sultan. She was born Alexandra Lisowska, a girl with frostbitten fingers and a mother who sang to the Virgin at night. That life ended the day the raiders came. The next time she opened her eyes, it was beneath a Turkish sky, naked and raw in a slave cart, her wrists bound with horsehair rope, her lips split from wind and screaming. They broke her in Constantinople, not with iron, but with perfume and hunger. The slave traders scrubbed her with vinegar and pomegranate, soaked her red curls in oil until they gleamed like fresh blood, and taught her to walk in silence. When the gates of Topkapi Palace swallowed her, she vanished from the world she once knew. The harem did not care for beauty. Beauty withered fast under musk and envy. But she had something else, a smile that could crack through stone, a laugh that unsettled even the older concubines. They called her Hurrem, the joyful one, though they whispered it like a curse. Suleiman the Magnificent chose her not once, but many times, and each time, she returned with eyes colder, back straighter, and secrets pressed between her teeth like thorns. She bore him sons, and not just children, but heirs. She became not only his lover but his wife, a title forbidden for centuries. In a court ruled by silence and silk, she moved like smoke, unseen until the knife had already found its throat. Mahidevran, the rival concubine, was the first to fall, exiled after one whispered accusation. Then came Ibrahim Pasha, strangled with a bowstring in the dead of night, his body dumped in the garden like a gutted dog. The Grand Vizier, once beloved, had crossed her. That was enough. She smiled when she passed his chambers after the killing, the same smile she wore when attending prayers, the same smile when she rocked her children to sleep. But in those years, the air in the palace began to change. The women of the court crossed themselves behind her back, fingers trembling over hidden crucifixes stitched into their bodices. The eunuchs who once bowed smoothly now blinked too long, hands twitching near their blades. Incense was lit twice as often. Doors began to close when she approached. Some said her presence made the oil lamps flicker. Others said her voice left a taste of copper in the air. And always, that smile. No warmth. No mirth. Just teeth. Just silence behind the eyes. Servants began to speak of odd smells in her chambers, not the perfume of rose or ambergris, but something sour, almost fungal. Her linens, once white, were now tinged yellow before nightfall. A chambermaid once claimed she saw worms in her bathwater, long, white things twisting in the steam. The girl was gone the next day. No explanation. No body. Just gone. By the time the whispers reached the Sultan's ear, it was too late. She was too deeply woven. Too close. Too needed. But even Suleiman, it is said, began to visit her less. He sent gifts instead of appearing in person. His eyes, once wide with awe at her cleverness, grew tired. She ruled from shadows now, wrapped in embroidered veils, surrounded by women who hated her, guarded by men who feared her, and buried in a power so absolute it had turned inward, like a body digesting itself. And still, she smiled. Even as the walls of Topkapi began to sweat with unease. Even as courtiers muttered prayers when her footsteps echoed. Even as her own skin began to fail her, and perfumes grew thicker, and the air around her thickened into something sweet, wet, and hard to breathe. The smile never left her face. But behind it, something ancient and rotting had begun to stir. By the winter of 1561, the sweet-smelling rot that clung to Hurrem Sultan could no longer be masked with rose oil or sandalwood incense. It seeped through her silk bedding, pooled in the pleats of her robes, and spread beneath her fingernails like ink. Her body, once the symbol of imperial allure, the vessel that birthed princes, had begun to die in pieces, turning her chambers into a mausoleum that still breathed, coughed, and screamed. The physicians came draped in layers of saffron linen, cloths pressed to their mouths, eyes cast low, their scrolls filled with gentle lies. They called it a disturbance of the liver, an imbalance of bile, a heat in the womb. But no one dared speak what they saw when the sheets were peeled back, the sallow skin stretched tight over a bloated stomach, the angry swelling of her thighs where ulcers festered and burst, the yellow film coating her tongue like pollen from a dead flower. At night, her cries echoed down the marble halls, high, wet sounds like something dying in a cradle. She would claw at her abdomen with both hands until the skin split beneath her rings. Blood, thick and dark as molasses, oozed from the corners of her mouth as she coughed. Her attendants, handpicked for silence, dabbed the corners of her eyes and nostrils, where crust formed like salt along a rotting dock. Some collapsed during their duties, overwhelmed by the stench, others bribed eunuchs to escape service, claiming visions, vomiting fits, or possession. The sheets were changed 3 times a day, but never burned. She refused it. "Nothing of me will feed the wind," she rasped once. So they were washed in vinegar and lye, though no amount of scouring could lift the iron blood stink from the fabric. She still wore her finest robes, gowns stitched with gold thread, pearls along the hem, but they clung to her like shrouds, wet and clotted, dark patches blooming beneath her breasts and hips where the sores wept their filth. Servants were ordered to paste honey and ground fig into the wounds, a prescription from one of the older hakims. But the moment the salve touched her skin, she shrieked, a high, animal sound, and the wound hissed, bubbled, and cracked like wet fat on a fire. She slapped the girl who applied it, drawing blood with her ring. The girl did not return. Each morning, the chamber pot was carried away with 2 hands, its contents thick, black, and sharp-smelling, like meat left in the sun. Once, a young eunuch tripped while removing it, and the contents spilled across the mosaic floor. He fell to his knees, weeping, wiping it with his sleeves. She watched him in silence, her lips dry and cracked, her eyes sunken into hollows that once shone with wit. When he was done, she said, flatly, "If that reaches the Sultan's shoes, I will order your throat opened with a butter knife." No news from the outer world was permitted to enter unless it concerned the misfortune of a rival. One morning, a messenger arrived with a poem, a gift from the Sultan, but she ordered it torn to strips and boiled in water. She drank the broth like medicine. Later, she vomited green bile onto the floor, and in it were flakes of silver ink, still shimmering. She commanded that every mirror in the palace be removed or covered. "Not for vanity," she murmured. "Only the devil should see what's inside me now." In the dark, with the windows shuttered and the air thick with rot, she became more shadow than flesh. When she moved, her bones clicked softly beneath the swollen meat of her limbs. When she coughed, it sounded wet and deep, as if the palace itself were drowning with her. In the outer halls, rumor grew like fungus. They called her the Queen of Corruption. They said her body was decomposing while she lived, that worms had been seen on her pillow, that her hair fell out in great black knots, and that she had started to speak in languages no one had taught her. One maid claimed to hear her praying to both Christ and Allah in the same breath. Another swore she saw smoke rise from her navel. And still, Hurrem ruled. Propped upright by cushions and slaves, her eyes bloodshot and lips drawn back from her gums. She gave orders in a rasping voice, demanded reports on political movements, and reviewed petitions with fingers that trembled from fever. Her words were still sharp, crueler than ever. But each time she raised her arm to signal approval or death, the skin beneath her sleeve peeled back like old fruit rind, revealing glimpses of blackened flesh, streaked with the yellow sheen of infection. There was no dignity left in her body. Only will. Only power that refused to die. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all, that she had become something no longer fully human, but still in control. By the time spring's warmth began to thaw the garden tiles of Topkapi in 1561, her chambers remained cold, unnaturally so, as though the air itself recoiled from her breath. The walls dripped with condensation not from the changing season, but from something else, something buried and seething, a rot of memory that had festered too long behind sealed doors and silken veils. It was in this sour, stagnant twilight that Hurrem Sultan began speaking to ghosts, or perhaps, began hearing them speak to her. At first, it was confined to fevered murmurs at night, Ottoman phrases tangled in Slavic lullabies, half-formed names twisted by a swollen tongue. But soon, the whispers grew louder, and she began to answer them. Not just at night. Not just in sleep. One morning, as a physician attempted to lift the hem of her robe to examine a rash that had blackened her hip, she slapped his wrist and hissed. You touch me in front of the prince? Have you no shame? There was no one there. They said it began with Mustafa. The prince. The son of Mahadevran. The one the soldiers had once begged the Sultan to spare. Strangled in his tent on campaign, choked by the silent hands of his father's guards. And though the Sultan gave the order, it was Hurrem who had sealed his fate. She had seen to the rumors, the fear, the whispers of rebellion that paved the way to the noose of silk. Now, in the final weeks of her life, the boy she had buried returned, not in flesh, but in voice, in shadow, in the smell of horses and blood that clung to her pillow despite the endless washing. Some nights she called to him, gentle and motherly, as though he were a boy again lost in the courtyard. Other times, she screamed. The guards reported crashing sounds, ceramic shattering against marble, a brazier overturned and left smoldering against silk drapery. One eunuch opened the door without knocking and found her crouched naked beside the bed, fingers blackened with dried blood, muttering in Turkish. Mustafa, I told them. I told them not to do it like that. I told them to use the silk, not the rope. Not the rope. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The bowl of lentils near her bed was filled with hair and fragments of broken porcelain. When asked who had brought it, she simply pointed behind the physician's shoulder and smiled with lips peeled dry from fever. He did. There was no one there. Later that week, the walls of her chamber were found smeared with brown streaks, not ink. One corner bore a crude circle, etched with her own nails, a mess of lines spiraling inward like a child's map of hell. A single word repeated over and over in Ottoman script. Bajisla. Forgive. No one cleaned it. No one dared. The eunuchs assigned to her care refused to cross the threshold after nightfall. Some claimed they saw shadows moving independently of torchlight, too tall, too wide. Others reported waking to find their ears bleeding after hearing her muttering behind closed doors in a voice that didn't sound like hers, deeper, rasping, male. She began speaking in Persian. Then Arabic. Then Greek. Languages no one had ever heard her use. She would recite fragments of scripture backward, mixing verses from the Quran with lines from Slavic folk prayers. On one occasion, she cried for nearly 3 hours, rocking herself violently, calling out for a little brother she had never spoken of before. Her knees bruised black from the motion. When the midwife approached to still her, she shrieked that the devil was using the woman's mouth, and clawed open the skin beneath her own eye. During one lucid afternoon, she ordered a full tea service to be prepared and placed at her bedside. When the tray was brought, she sat upright, barely able to hold herself up, and gestured to the air beside her. Set it here. The prince doesn't like his tea cold. She laughed then. A shrill, mirthless cackle that seemed to echo off the stones as though the room were deeper than it was, wider than it could be. The servant fled, dropping the tray, porcelain shattering into blood-shaped shards on the floor. Hurrem did not flinch. She simply turned her head, eyes glistening, and whispered. We're all invited now. The palace astrologers were consulted in secret. One swore that a shadow passed across the moon that week, shaped like a noose. Another warned that the fire in her soul was not earthly, and that the spirits of the executed were clawing back into the world through her mouth. But no one stopped her. No one restrained her. No one prayed for her. Because by then, no one knew whether what spoke in that room was still Hurrem Sultan, or something older, colder, and wearing her skin like a veil. By late spring of 1561, the imperial harem, once a sanctum of opulence, desire, and tightly coiled political ambition, had soured into a place where few dared breathe too deeply. The tiled floors that once shimmered with light from colored glass lanterns were now slick with moisture that seemed to rise not from the air, but from within the very stone, as if the marble wept in response to the decay it now contained. What had once been a palace of scented silks and secret whispers had become a rotting husk, hollowed out by fear, saturated with the reek of dying flesh, and ruled from within by a woman dissolving hour by hour into something unrecognizable. They stopped calling her Hurrem. Among the servants, she became the corpse that speaks. Among the maids, she was the widow of death. Each morning, the air around her quarters was thick with a filmy, sour stench, not just the foulness of sickness, but a layered smell of meat left to sweat in linen, of spoiled milk, of something wet and sweet turning septic. It clung to the curtains, seeped into the doorframes, and nested in the fabric of the eunuchs' robes no matter how many times they washed them with vinegar. Those who were forced to serve her began burning sprigs of myrtle and juniper beneath their clothes, not to please her. She no longer noticed such things, but to keep whatever spirits hovered in her breath from entering their lungs. The maids whispered of nightmares in which they awoke to the sensation of her breath against their necks, cold, rhythmic, ragged, as if she had been kneeling beside their beds, exhaling centuries of curses into their ears. One girl fled shrieking after Hurrem approached her during an episode, leaned close, and rasped, "He's in the rafters now." Moments later, her knees gave out. Blood began to leak from her nostrils and the inner corners of her eyes. She was dragged from the room unconscious, twitching, and never returned. Her gums had begun to rot, not in the normal, gradual yellowing of age, but in sudden blackened recessions, pulling away from her teeth like scorched parchment. When she smiled, which she did now without reason, sometimes for hours, mouth fixed in a ghastly crescent, her teeth gleamed like tombstone enamel sunk into gray meat. During one meal, a molar fell out whole into her bowl of broth, clinking against the rim. No one spoke. No one even blinked. The servant who cleared the tray took it away as if nothing had happened, but his hands trembled, and he scrubbed them for hours until the skin cracked. The Sultan no longer came. Not even in dreams. Her son sent eunuchs to deliver perfumed letters and folded silks, empty gestures delivered with downcast eyes. She responded only with silence or sudden fury, tearing the fabrics with her nails, biting the edges of scrolls until her mouth bled. The walls of the harem had begun to sweat. Thin trails of condensation slipped down the mosaics like tears. Beneath them, mold bloomed black and green, curling at the edges like tongues. The polished marble, once cold and smooth, now felt slimy underfoot. A physician slipped one morning and landed in a puddle of discharge that had soaked through her bedding, past the mattress, and into the stone itself. He vomited as he stood. Her gowns, silk brocades once stitched with verses from the Quran in gold thread, were discarded each dawn, heavy with sweat, pus, and thin, red fluid that oozed from the open sores blooming along her back and thighs. They were burned in the courtyard before midday call to prayer, the smoke sour and clinging, watched by guards who muttered supplications under their breath with eyes half shut, as if afraid to see what lingered in the flame. Even the guards no longer passed her doors in silence. They began reciting surahs aloud as they walked by, fingers curled tightly around talismans made from bits of Quranic script sealed in beeswax and goat hide. Some crossed themselves, quietly, quickly, a gesture forbidden in the palace, but ignored now. The usual laws had bent under the weight of something darker than superstition. Each dusk, just as the sun slipped behind the Bosphorus and the sky turned the color of spoiled pomegranate, a single crow would descend upon the wooden beam above her windows and settle there, wings folded tight, head cocked to the side. It did not call. It did not move. It simply stared through the shutters, motionless, night after night, until dawn, when it would vanish into the fog without a sound. Some said it was a jinn made flesh, summoned by her crimes to witness their conclusion. Others said it was Mustafa. Watching. Waiting. And still, she lived, barely, her breath rattling like iron in a dry throat, her eyes swollen and clouded, her body a cathedral of filth. But the harem, that sacred space of the empire's heart, had already died. What remained was a mausoleum. And she, its queen of rot. In the final days of her life, Hurrem Sultan, once the radiant consort who bent an empire with a whisper, lay in a room sealed from the world, suffocating in her own stench, her own silence, her own unfinished prayers. The sun still crossed the marble courtyard beyond her shutters, but its warmth never reached her, blocked by boards nailed over every window, each spike hammered in by eunuchs with trembling hands. They said it was to keep out the drafts. In truth, it was to keep something in. She had not stood upright in weeks. Her legs had shriveled beneath her, veins bulging beneath papery skin, darkened by clots that pulsed slowly, thick as tar. Her fingernails had turned blue days ago, and then gray, curled inward like cracked shells, caked with dirt and skin she had torn from her own arms during nights of fevered delirium. The gowns they wrapped her in now were coarse and loose, thrown across her rotting flesh like offerings on a corpse too blasphemous to touch directly. The scent that filled her chamber was no longer the fetid rot of the sick, it was something worse, something ancient, heavy with iron and bile, a bitter perfume that clung to stone and choked the throat of any who dared enter. The guards no longer announced themselves. They tapped 3 times, slid food inside, and left without a word. The food was never touched. By then, her voice was a rasping ruin, raw from screaming, blistered from the acid that rose unchecked from her decaying gut. But the words, when they came, were clear. "Bring me the cord. Let him come. Let it end." Sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed, but always the same plea. She had watched countless others die in silence, Mahadevran's son strangled like a dog on campaign, her rivals vanished into damp sacks and silken nooses, all wrapped in ritual, in mercy, in royal permission. Now she begged for the same end. A death with a hand upon her shoulder. A clean, sanctioned silence. But no executioner ever came. Her voice cracked. Her body sagged. The palace had decided she would die not with ceremony, but with rot. Her tongue split the day before the end, not by blade, but by pressure, by fever, by the unrelenting dryness that turned her mouth into a cracked oven of breath and blood. She tried to speak that day, but only a wet clicking came. The eunuchs at the door did not look in. They stared at the floor. They counted the seconds until the noise stopped. When the end came, it was not with dignity or peace. It began with a low moan, almost childlike, drawn from some hollow beneath her ribs. Her limbs jerked once, then again, spasming against the damp sheets until her left arm curled stiffly inward, fingers clenched around a clump of fabric as though grasping for one last scrap of will. Her other hand opened, trembled, and curled as if to touch something, someone, who never arrived. Her eyes rolled upward, whites blooming like milk across cloudy pupils. A sound escaped her lips, a gurgle, a rattle, deep and wet, echoing against the wooden slats of her bed frame like the toll of a slow, final bell. The silence afterward was thicker than blood. Her body released in stages, a slow, spreading stain of black bile pooling beneath her hips, soaking into the mattress, dripping onto the floor with an audible pat every few seconds. Her bladder let go. A thin stream of yellow ran between the floor tiles, disappearing beneath the curtain hem. No one approached. The eunuchs remained at the threshold, back stiff, breathing through cloth, eyes fixed on the far wall. They waited for a full hour before entering. When they did, they found her mouth slightly open, not in agony, but in posture. A shape so familiar, so rehearsed, that for a moment, it looked as though she might whisper one more command. One final order. One last name. But there was only silence. No morning wails. No official trumpet. No final rites. Only a closed door, a bed soaked in fluids, and a woman who had once ruled the harem, the sultan, and the tides of empire, now reduced to twisted limbs, peeling skin, and an expression that hovered somewhere between command and terror. There was no cord. No blade. No execution. Just the slow digestion of her sins by a body that refused to die quickly. And a death as filthy, as lingering, as feared as the life she carved from others. They buried her beneath marble in silence. The tomb, a domed mausoleum carved with verses from the Quran and adorned in turquoise tiles imported from distant Khorasan, stood beside that of Suleiman the Magnificent, her husband, her master, her conquest. They said he had once named her Hurrem, the joyful one, and written love letters in his own hand. But when her body was finally carried from the rotting chamber where she died, no verses were spoken aloud. No lament echoed through the gardens. The birds did not sing. Only the grating of cartwheels on the stone, and the soft squelch of soaked linen, could be heard as the procession moved forward under a sun too pale to warm the living. They say the pallbearers wore gloves not out of reverence, but necessity, to keep the stench from seeping into their skin. Her flesh had bloated in death, split open in places where the pressure had grown too great. Her lips had pulled back from her teeth, revealing a twisted smile, waxy and glistening, as though she were still whispering secrets through rigor mortis. The mausoleum itself rose proud and perfect, but something within it refused to settle. No pigeons ever landed on its dome. No ivy climbed its walls. The rose bushes planted at its base withered by the season's end, no matter how often they were replaced. The gardeners stopped trying after the fourth set. One slit his own throat behind the stables, muttering that he saw her mouth moving beneath the stone slab. Mothers began to tell stories. Not as warnings, but as rituals. They told their daughters not to smile too widely at strangers, not to ever step on roses, and to never trust a woman who whispered to herself at night. They told tales of midwives who died in blood-soaked deliveries after praying for Hurrem's protection. Of stillborns born with clenched fists and teeth already black. Of figures glimpsed in mirrors, not reflections but shadows, gaunt and swollen, trailing long red cloths that slithered like tongues across the floor. The guard stationed near the tomb reported strange things, lanterns extinguishing themselves, ash on the floor where no incense had been burned, the sound of fabric dragging behind them though they walked alone. Some refused the assignment altogether, bribing others to take their place, claiming they heard the call to prayer sung in a hoarse woman's voice from within the crypt. And in Topkapi itself, her name was spoken less and less, not out of erasure, but fear. They whispered of seeing her in the hammams, steam swirling around a figure bent and sagging, her scalp patched with mold, her hands raw, her teeth clicking against each other like bones in a wind chime. One maid claimed she heard her laugh from a locked storeroom, not the sound of joy, but the brittle, echoing giggle of a child playing with something dead. Then came the plague. It started near her tomb, 2 gravediggers, both young, both strong, both dead within days. Black lesions across their armpits, vomit that stank of blood and curdled milk, voices that dissolved into screams by midnight. Then the stable boys. Then a scribe. By the time the Sultan's court realized what was happening, dozens were dead. The corridors around her burial site were sealed. The mullahs were summoned to bless the air itself. One of them collapsed on the stairs, blood dripping from his ears. He lived just long enough to say, "It's not the plague. It's her." Some called it divine retribution. Others, superstition. But most simply looked away. And whispered. Her tomb still stands. Visitors pass it without stopping, eyes sliding over the stone as if it were a trick of the light. The inscriptions fade faster than those on other graves. Coins left on the threshold disappear overnight, not collected, not stolen, gone. And those who linger too long, who place a hand on the cold marble, sometimes wake the next morning with red marks along their wrists, as if something had gripped them in the night. She lies beside Suleiman. Her name etched in gold. Her legacy sealed in blood. Hurrem's death did not end the empire's intrigues, but it left a scar upon the Ottoman psyche. Her son Selim II, weak, drunk, and half fearful of his mother's legacy, took the throne. But he never commanded her control. The empire shifted. The harem lost its tyrant. But power, once tasted by a woman in a man's world, left its echo. The ghost of Hurrem Sultan haunted the dynasty for generations, not in body, but in the paranoia of men, and the ambitions of women who came after.